You are told that destiny is a quiet, gentle thing. But what if your destiny began with a terrifying mistake, a torrential storm, a wrong turn in the darkest forests of Europe, and a carriage that delivered a helpless bride straight into the arms of the most feared immortal? History books, particularly the sealed chronicles housed within the Bavarian Royal Archives, will tell you that the sudden disappearance of Josephine Ashcroft in the winter of 1893 was a tragic carriage accident. The official records signed by local magistrates and stamped by the regional governors state that her carriage plunged into the freezing waters of the River Rhone during a freak blizzard. The Ashcroft family, a once proud lineage of British aristocrats who had fallen into crippling financial ruin, held a closed-casket funeral. Society mourned for a week, and then she was forgotten. But the truth, hidden in the private diaries of a terrified carriage driver and the whispered legends of the European underworld, is far more terrifying and far more romantic. Josephine was not lost to the river. She was sold. Her father, Lord Richard Ashcroft, had squandered the family fortune on failed investments with the formidable Dutch East India Company and reckless gambling in the underground parlours of London. To save himself from the debtors' prison and the far more lethal debt collectors of the criminal syndicate, he struck a deal with Alistair Montgomery. Alistair was a reclusive, obscenely wealthy nobleman who resided in a fortress near the jagged borders of Romania. He was a man surrounded by dark rumours. The locals called him a leech, a man who never seemed to age, whose previous 3 wives had all succumbed to mysterious, wasting diseases. Josephine, at merely 21 years old, was the price of her family's salvation. The journey to Alistair's estate was a nightmare from the moment the horses left Paris. The weather had turned violently against them. By the time the carriage crossed into the dense, ancient forests of the Carpathian Basin, the sky had bruised into a deep, violent purple. Rain lashed against the wooden carriage like handfuls of gravel. Inside the freezing cabin, Josephine clutched her velvet cloak tightly around her shoulders. She was trembling, though, whether from the bitter cold or the paralyzing fear of her impending wedding night, she could not say. She fingered the heavy gold locket around her neck, a final pathetic apology gift from her father. "We are hopelessly lost, Miss Ashcroft." The voice of her driver, William, cracked through the small speaking window. He sounded utterly terrified. "What do you mean, lost?" Josephine called back, her voice shaking. Lord Montgomery's directions were explicitly clear. Keep to the King's Road until you see the iron gates flanked by the stone gargoyles. The road washed out 3 miles back. We took the old logging trail to bypass the flood, but the fog, it's like it's alive. It swallowed the path. Josephine wiped the condensation from the glass and peered out into the consuming darkness. William was right. The fog was impossibly thick, clinging to the skeletal trees like grey spider webs. The carriage jolted violently, throwing Josephine against the plush leather seats. Outside, the horses screamed a high, unnatural sound of pure panic before the carriage ground to a sudden, violent halt. "William!" Josephine cried out. There was no answer, only the deafening roar of the storm and the heavy rhythmic thud of her own heart. She waited for what felt like an eternity, her breath pluming in the freezing air. When William did not return to the window, she summoned a courage she didn't know she possessed. She pushed open the carriage door and stepped out into the freezing mud. The rain immediately soaked through her heavy travelling dress. William was nowhere to be seen. The horses were lathered in sweat, their eyes rolling in terror, pulling frantically against their harnesses. Then she saw it. Through a sudden break in the unnatural fog, a structure loomed. It was not the relatively modern 18th-century manor that Alistair Montgomery had described in his letters. This was a colossal, ancient Gothic citadel. Its towers pierced the storm clouds like blackened needles. The stone was dark, almost obsidian, and heavy iron gates stood wide open, seemingly inviting her in. Above the archway, a crest was carved into the stone, not the Montgomery stag, but a terrifying emblem of a winged serpent entwined with a crescent moon. Josephine was entirely alone in a deadly storm. She had no horses to ride, no driver to guide her, and the freezing rain was already sapping the warmth from her blood. Survival instinct took over. Gathering the heavy skirts of her soaked dress, she stumbled through the mud, passing through the towering iron gates, and walked up the massive stone steps to the heavy oak doors of the castle. She lifted the iron knocker, shaped like a wolf's head, and let it fall. It echoed with a heavy, final thud. To her shock, the door slowly groaned open on its own hinges, revealing a cavernous, dimly lit entrance hall. The air inside was shockingly warm and smelled faintly of burning cedar-old parchment and something metallic like rain on hot iron. "Hello," Josephine called out, her voice trembling. "Is anyone there? I am Josephine Ashcroft, the intended bride of Lord Montgomery. My carriage has broken down." Silence answered her. She stepped over the threshold, and the heavy oak doors slammed shut behind her, with a sound like a thunderclap sealing her inside. The storm was instantly muted. The oppressive silence of the castle rushed in to take its place. She had arrived at a castle, yes, but as she stood shivering in the grand foyer, surrounded by centuries-old tapestries and shadows that seemed to dance without a light source, she realized with a sickening drop in her stomach she was in the wrong castle. The grand hall of the obsidian citadel was a masterpiece of terrifying architecture. Towering pillars of black marble held up a ceiling that was lost in shadows. Along the walls, massive portraits of pale aristocratic figures stared down at her with hollow, predatory eyes. The warmth of the hall was a stark contrast to the freezing tempest outside, yet it did nothing to stop the violent shaking of Josephine's body. "Lord Montgomery," she tried again, her voice barely a whisper this time. "Is there a servant? Anyone? Alistair Montgomery is a parasite who lacks the courage to step foot within 50 miles of my domain." The voice came from the shadows above the grand, sweeping staircase. It was a masculine voice, deep, resonant, and possessing a velvet smoothness that sent a shiver down Josephine's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. It was an aristocratic voice, carrying an accent she couldn't quite place, older than the British nobility she was accustomed to carrying the cadence of centuries past. Josephine gasped, taking a step back, as a figure emerged from the darkness of the landing. He moved with a fluid, terrifying grace, his footsteps making absolutely no sound on the marble stairs. As he descended into the dim light of the candelabras, Josephine's breath caught in her throat. He was devastatingly handsome, but in a way that defied human logic. His cheekbones were sharp enough to cut glass, his jawline rigid and aristocratic. His hair was thick and dark, falling carelessly over a forehead that was paler than the moon outside. He wore a tailored suit of charcoal velvet, impeccably neat, though devoid of the gaudy frills common to modern high society. But it was his eyes that paralyzed her. They were a piercing, iridescent silver, glowing with an inner luminescence that locked onto her like a predator finding its prey. This was not Alistair Montgomery. Who are you?" Josephine stammered, backing away until her shoulders hit the heavy oak door. She fumbled behind her for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The man reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. He didn't approach her immediately. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his silver eyes tracking the steady pulse at the base of her neck. He inhaled deeply, his chest expanding, and a strange, almost a confused expression crossed his immortal features. "I am Caspian Hawthorne," he said, the name vibrating through the cavernous hall. It was a name Josephine had heard in whispered ghost stories back in London, the Blood King of the Valois region, the ancient sovereign of the night, whom even the lesser vampires feared. "And you are trespassing in my ancestral home, though it seems you were brought here. I took a wrong turn." Josephine pleaded her hands, trembling as she tried to wring the rainwater from her skirts. The storm. My driver got lost. I'm supposed to be at the Montgomery estate. I am his bride. At the word bride, a low, dangerous rumble vibrated in Caspian's chest. It sounded like the growl of a massive, caged beast. He took a slow step toward her. Then another. Josephine pressed herself flat against the door, her heart hammering frantically against her ribs. He was so close now that she could feel the cold radiating from him, contrasting with the warm air of the hall. He towered over her, radiating a primal, overwhelming power. Caspian leaned in, stopping mere inches from her face. He closed his eyes and inhaled again, his nose brushing lightly against the damp skin of her cheek, trailing down to the curve of her neck. Josephine froze, terrified that if she moved, he would tear her throat out. But he didn't bite. Instead, she heard his breath hitch. When Caspian opened his eyes, the silver had darkened into a stormy, mesmerizing grey. The predatory coldness in his gaze had vanished, replaced by an intensity that made Josephine's knees weak. Montgomery Saul. Caspian spat the name like venom, taking a step back to look at her properly. That spineless wretch told you that you were to be his bride. Yes, Josephine whispered, confused. My father arranged the marriage to settle our debts. A harsh, humorless laugh echoed from Caspian. Your father sold you to a slaughterhouse? Alistair Montgomery does not take brides, little human. He takes blood slaves. You were not brought here to wear white and sip champagne. You were meant to be chained in his cellar until he drained you dry to pay off his debts to the High Council. The words hit Josephine like a physical blow. The rumors of his previous wives, the wasting diseases. The blood drained from her face, and the room began to spin. Her father had known. He had to have known. He sent her to die just to save his own skin. A sob tore from her throat, and her legs finally gave out. She expected to hit the hard marble floor, but she never did. Strong, cold arms caught her instantly. Caspian pulled her flush against his chest, lifting her into his arms as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. He held her against him, and despite his cold temperature, she felt an inexplicable magnetic pull toward him. It was a feeling of absolute, irrational safety. But the carriage, Josephine wept into his velvet coat, the reality of her betrayal breaking her. The carriage driver made a mistake. We took the wrong road in the storm. I am at the wrong castle. Caspian looked down at her, his expression softening into something ancient and reverent. He reached up his long, cool fingers, gently brushing a wet strand of hair from her tear-stained cheek. His thumb rested lightly over her racing pulse. There was no mistake. Caspian murmured his voice, dropping to a low, intimate timbre that vibrated through her very soul. My kind have watched Alistair's movements for centuries. I felt a shift in the air tonight. The storm was not a natural occurrence. I called it to block the roads. I compelled the fog to guide your carriage away from his borders and into mine. Josephine looked up at him, her eyes wide with shock. You brought me here. Why am I to be your prisoner instead? Caspian's silver eyes locked onto hers, burning with an intensity that stripped away all her fear, leaving only a breathless anticipation. He leaned his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. For 400 years I have ruled in the shadows, waiting for a prophecy I thought was a myth. Caspian whispered, his breath ghosting over her lips. I smelled your blood on the wind 3 miles away, and my dead heart tried to beat. You were never meant for a weakling like Montgomery. He opened his eyes, and Josephine saw the absolute terrifying truth in them. The bride was sent to the wrong castle. Caspian said, his voice thick with an emotion that bordered on worship. But the moon finally sent me my mate. The days that followed Josephine's arrival at the Hawthorne Citadel blurred into a surreal, intoxicating dream. She did not wake up in a damp dungeon, nor was she chained to a stone wall as the horrifying rumors of the immortal world had suggested. Instead, she found herself in a sprawling, sunlit suite, draped in crimson silk and gold-spun thread, overlooking the sweeping, snow-covered valleys of the Carpathian Mountains. Caspian proved to be nothing like the monstrous leeches detailed in the penny dreadfuls of London. He was a king commanding an ancient, terrifying authority, yet around her he was as gentle as a summer breeze. He did not force himself upon her, nor did he demand her blood. He offered her sanctuary, treating her with a reverence that made her chest ache. For the first time in her life, Josephine was not a pawn in her father's disastrous financial games. She was treated as an equal, a queen walking among shadows. However, the shadows were beginning to lengthen. The peace of the Hawthorne citadel was a fragile illusion, and the reality of Josephine's past was rushing to catch up with her. Late one evening, the heavy oak doors of Caspian's private study burst open. Lord Reginald Fairfax, Caspian's oldest confidant and the chief diplomat of the Valois region, strode into the room. His face, usually a mask of stoic, immortal calm, was tight with unprecedented anxiety. Josephine, who had been sitting by the roaring fire reading a collection of early Renaissance poetry, lowered her book. Caspian, standing by the window looking out into the night, turned slowly, his silver eyes flashing with warning. "My king." Reginald bowed stiffly, clutching a roll of thick, wax-sealed parchment. "We have received a formal declaration from the High Council. It concerns the human." Caspian's jaw tightened. He moved effortlessly across the room, placing himself protectively between Reginald and Josephine. "Speak, Reginald. What game is Montgomery playing? It is no game." "Caspian." Reginald sighed heavily, unrolling the parchment. "Alistair Montgomery has invoked the ancient rights of the Treaty of Westphalia, the very same blood pacts forged in 1648 to prevent our kind from slaughtering one another over territory and property. He possesses a binding, magically sealed contract, signed by Lord Richard Ashcroft. The contract explicitly transfers ownership of Josephine Ashcroft to Montgomery in exchange for the forgiveness of £80,000 of debt." Josephine felt the blood drain from her face. £80,000. Her father had sold her soul for a sum that he had likely already lost at the baccarat tables of Mayfair. "I am not a piece of property to be traded," Josephine whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of profound grief and rising anger. "In the eyes of human law, perhaps not," Reginald said, gently pity softening his immortal features. "But in the eyes of the High Council, a blood-sealed contract is absolute. Montgomery is demanding his stolen property be returned by the next full moon, which is but 3 days away. If you refuse to surrender her Caspian, it is an act of war. The Council will sanction Montgomery to march on the citadel with his enforcers." Caspian let out a dark, booming laugh that rattled the crystal decanters on the mahogany desk. It was a terrifying sound, devoid of any humor. "Let him march!" Caspian snarled, his fangs briefly descending, catching the firelight. "Let that pathetic, decaying parasite bring his enforcers to my gates. I will paint the snow with their ashes before I let them lay a single finger on my mate." "Caspian, please listen to reason," Reginald pleaded, stepping forward. "Montgomery is not acting alone. We have uncovered why he desires the Ashcroft girl so desperately. It is not merely a matter of a bride or a blood slave to pay off his debts. It is her lineage." Josephine stood up, her heart hammering against her ribs. "My lineage? The Ashcrofts are bankrupt aristocrats. There is nothing special about our bloodline. Not the Ashcrofts," Reginald corrected, turning his intense gaze upon her. "Your mother's line. The maternal records your father tried to bury in the London archives. Your mother was a direct descendant of the House of Plantagenet, carrying a dormant, ancient genetic anomaly. You possess the blood of the Silver Rose. Your blood does not just sustain an immortal, it has the power to heal the incurable. The room fell dead silent. Caspian stared at Josephine, realization dawning in his piercing silver eyes. Montgomery is rotting, Caspian whispered, piecing the puzzle together. His centuries of dabbling in forbidden dark magic are finally catching up with him. The wasting disease that killed his previous wives. He drained them trying to cure himself, but they were commoners. He needs the blood of the Silver Rose to halt his own decay. If he takes her, Reginald said grimly, he will chain her to a table and drain her drop by drop, day after day, keeping her barely alive until her veins run dry. And the council will let him, because the contract gives him the legal right to do so. Josephine sank back into her chair, the sheer horror of her reality crashing over her. She was not just a bride. She was medicine. A sacrificial lamb, bred for the slaughterhouse. She looked up at Caspian, tears welling in her eyes, expecting him to see her as a liability, a war he could not afford to fight. Instead, Caspian crossed the room and dropped to his knees before her. The king of the Valois region, a creature of unspeakable power, knelt at her feet. He took her trembling, delicate hands in his cold, strong ones, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. "Listen to me, Josephine," Caspian said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that commanded her absolute attention. "I do not care about the High Council. I do not care about the Treaty of Westphalia. I have waited 4 centuries to feel my heart beat, and it only beats when you are near. You are not a contract. You are not a cure. You are my queen. And if the world must burn to keep you safe, then I will strike the match myself." The night of the full moon arrived with an oppressive, suffocating weight. The sky above the Carpathian Mountains was a canvas of inky black, punctuated by a massive, swollen moon that glowed an eerie blood-red hue. It was the blood moon, a night of peak power for the immortal races, and the deadline set by the High Council. Josephine stood on the grand balcony of the citadel, wrapped in a heavy cloak of black fox fur, her breath pluming in the freezing air. Beside her stood Caspian, clad in battle armor of midnight steel, looking like a terrifying, beautiful god of war. Behind them, the courtyard was filled with Caspian's elite guard, hundreds of immortals standing in absolute lethal silence, their red eyes glowing in the darkness. At the base of the mountain, a sea of torches flickered into view. Montgomery's forces had arrived. Within minutes, the heavy iron gates of the citadel groaned open to admit a small delegation under the banner of parley. Leading them was Alistair Montgomery. He was a stark contrast to Caspian's dark majesty. Montgomery was gaunt, his skin pallid and stretched too tight over his skull, his hair thinning and brittle. Despite his lavish garments, he looked exactly like what he was, a decaying, desperate creature clinging to life. "Caspian Hawthorne," Montgomery's voice was a reedy, grating sneer that echoed off the stone walls. "I have come for my rightful property. The High Council stands behind my claim. Hand over the Ashcroft girl, and I will be merciful enough to leave your kingdom intact." Caspian stepped to the edge of the balcony, his presence radiating a crushing, suffocating aura of pure power. "You possess nothing here, Alistair. Turn back now, and I will be merciful enough to let you keep your head." "She is mine," Montgomery shrieked, waving the wax-sealed contract in the air. "Signed in blood by her own father, you defy the sacred laws of our kind. Hawthorne, if you do not surrender her, the Council will strip you of your crown and burn this pathetic castle to the ground." Josephine looked down at the desperate, cruel man who had intended to use her as a living blood bag. She looked at the army at his back, And then she looked at Caspian, who was ready to sacrifice his kingdom, his throne, and potentially his immortal life just to protect her. She remembered the ancient texts she had read in Caspian's library over the past 3 days. The laws of the High Council were archaic, rigid, and absolute. A blood contract was unbreakable unless it was superseded by a higher, more sacred magic. "Caspian," Josephine whispered, stepping forward to stand shoulder to shoulder with him at the edge of the balcony. "There is a way to stop this without a war." Caspian looked at her, his brow furrowing. Josephine stepped back. "It is not safe. The law states that a human can be bound by a property contract," Josephine said, her voice steady, surprisingly loud in the crisp night air. She locked eyes with Caspian, her heart pounding with a fierce, undeniable certainty. "But a bonded mate of an immortal sovereign cannot be owned. A queen answers to no contract." Reginald, standing a few paces away, gasped. "She is right, my king. The right of the eternal bond supersedes all mortal contracts. But the human must offer her blood willingly, and she must take yours in return. It will bind her to you forever, and it will begin her transition." Montgomery, hearing this from the courtyard below, flew into a panic. "No, that is illegal. Stop them, seize the girl." His enforcers lunged forward, but Caspian's guards drew their blades in unison, a terrifying sound of ringing steel that halted the advance. Caspian turned fully to Josephine, his silver eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. "Josephine, do you understand what you are asking? If we do this, you can never go back to the sunlight. You will be bound to me to the night for all eternity. I wanted to give you time. I never wanted to force this upon you." "You aren't forcing me, Caspian," Josephine said softly, reaching up to cup his cold, sharp cheek. "My father sold me to a monster, but fate sent me to my mate. I do not want the sunlight, if it means living without you. I choose this. I choose you." With a trembling hand, she pushed the heavy collar of her fur cloak aside, baring the delicate, pulsing expanse of her neck. Caspian's eyes darkened from silver to a bottomless, hungry black. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound of absolute possession and overwhelming love. He pulled her flush against his armored chest, one hand tangling in her hair, tilting her head back. "Forever, my queen," he whispered fiercely. And then he bit down. The pain was a brief, sharp pinch, instantly swallowed by a rush of unimaginable euphoria. Josephine gasped, her fingers digging into Caspian's armor as his venom flooded her veins. It felt like liquid fire burning away her mortal frailties, awakening the ancient dormant power of the silver rose within her. She felt his heartbeat, strong, rhythmic, and perfectly synchronized with her own. Caspian pulled back his lips, stained with her crimson blood. Without hesitation, he bit into his own wrist, tearing the flesh, and pressed it to her lips. "Drink, my love." Josephine drank. The king's blood was intoxicating, tasting of rich earth-old magic and raw power. The moment she swallowed, a shockwave of energy blasted outward from the balcony. The magical wax seal on Montgomery's contract, held tightly in his skeletal hand, down in the courtyard, suddenly burst into blue flames. Montgomery screamed, dropping the parchment, as it turned instantly to ash, dissolving into the winter wind. The contract was nullified. Josephine opened her eyes. The world had changed. She could see the intricate patterns of the snowflakes falling miles away. She could hear the terrified, erratic heartbeat of Alistair Montgomery in the courtyard below. And when she looked at Caspian, she didn't just see a king. She felt the unbreakable eternal tether of their souls. "The contract is broken," Reginald's voice boomed over the courtyard, resonating with triumph. "Behold Josephine Hawthorne, bonded mate to the blood king queen of the Valois. Any who raise a hand against her commit treason against the crown and the High Council." Montgomery fell to his knees in the snow, weeping in absolute defeat. His cure was gone. His claim was shattered. Without a word, his mercenary enforcers, realizing they were now standing against a fully bonded sovereign pair, sheathed their weapons and began to back away into the forest, leaving the decaying lord to his fate. Caspian wrapped his cape around his new queen, holding her tightly against his side as they watched the pathetic remains of Montgomery's forces retreat. The storm clouds finally broke, allowing the blood-red light of the moon to wash over the balcony, bathing them in its glow. "They will sing of this night for 1,000 years," Caspian murmured, kissing the top of her head. "Let them sing." Josephine smiled, her newly formed fangs grazing her lower lip. She leaned into the embrace of the monster who had saved her life finally home. Destiny makes no mistakes. Did fate or a simple wrong turn lead Josephine to her immortal king? Her story proves that sometimes the darkest storms lead us exactly where we belong. If you were captivated by Josephine and Caspian's eternal romance, hit that like button. Share this chilling love story with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more dark, dramatic tales of forbidden love and gothic twists. See you next time.